All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to, let's call it a special report for CFB Incubator, the website that covers the Scranton Wilkes-Barre area and all the outstanding college football players it has produced. My name is Matt Buffano. My guest is James or Jim Sullivan. And today we are talking about Eddie Burke, a tremendous football player, an All-American at Navy, but an even more distinguished and more celebrated war hero and naval officer. James wrote the book, quite literally, on Eddie and the other members of the USS Plunkett. This book right here, Unsinkable, was released in 2020 by Simon and Schuster, and across the internet, it has thousands of ratings, hundreds of reviews, overwhelmingly positive. So, Jim, it's a belated, 4 years late. Congratulations on publishing this, but congratulations on, the great work you did here. And thanks for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here and to have a chance to talk about Eddie Burke again.
Yeah. So let's start by just establishing some of the basics about Eddie Burke. A lot of the readers on my website are obviously from the Scranton Wilkes-Barre area, so they'd be um, familiar with Larksville High School, which is here on the west side of Luzerne County. That's where Eddie went to school. Um, Coal mining community. I believe that Eddie's, what was it? Maybe his father was a coal miner or his grandfather. There were definitely some roots there. I don't know
There
if you
were.
recall.
Yeah.
So, coming from Larksville High School, going to the Navy, what are some of the key details that people should understand about either Eddie's early life or his college career that help paint a picture for where he would ultimately go?
I guess, well, maybe that the first thing you'd say about Eddie Burke is that he was a scrapper, and that's partly given his upbringing growing up in Larksville, Wilkes-Barre. He was the grandson, actually great grandson of Irish immigrants. His grandfather was born in the United States, was a coal miner, was in and out of the mines back in the 1870s. The Molly Maguires were at large in the region at that time, so the miners were in and out of work. So Eddie was born of that tradition of, this is what you did. You went down into the mines. His father started down in the mines, but then came up out of them to, build more of a white collar career for himself. He became a justice of the peace, worked for the railroad, and was rather well to do, but never left, the old streets of Larksville and the collieries. So Eddie grew up amongst the sons of coal breakers and slave pickers, and he was a scrapper. He was one of a half a dozen kids. I think he had four sisters, no brothers, and so he took to the streets to make his friends, to have his scraps, and that's how he came up. He come up into high school like that.
Yeah, and he actually didn't even play high school football. One of the interesting parts of this, did not play high school football, gets to the Navy, and ultimately becomes an All-American guard, like we said. I think the head coach at the time was Bill Ingram, who called him
Mhm.
one of the best players that he'd ever coached. An interesting piece about his college career that we talked about before we got on the interview was when they played, Navy played against Notre Dame at Soldier Field. I believe it was 1928, before an estimated attendance of 120,000. And I looked up, I mean, I'm a Penn State grad, huge Penn State fan. Beaver Stadium holds about 107, 108,000. So I was like, man, that has to be some sort of record. And it is a record. It is officially in the NCAA record book as tied for the largest estimated attendance of a college football game pre 1948.
Right.
Because once you got to 1948, I think they started auditing the figures a little bit more. They became a little bit more official. But that 120,000. So, I mean, this is a really celebrated football figure. He was a captain for the Navy as well, not just, in his Navy officer career, but for the Navy football team. And also a boxer, right? What could you tell us about, either his boxing career or football career that people should understand?
Yeah, well, he went into the academy as a plebe. In his first year, he was fighting light heavyweight, and Coach Ingram one day was looking out to round out his team with some more people. Went to where the boxers were training, and he thought, those are the kinds of those guys have the kind of metal I need on my line. So he went and he saw Eddie Burke, and he said, "Yeah, this I need this guy as a guard." And so he recruited Eddie for the team, and Eddie continued to box while he was at the academy, but he also played his last 3 years for Bill Ingram on the football team and became, in that last season in 1928, the captain. It's sort of interesting that picture. There's a picture of Eddie with Fred Miller, who was the captain of the Notre Dame team. I believe I may be mixing it up, but there's a really cool photo of the two of them in the middle of Soldier Field with that crowd of 120,000 around them and only one captain per team in those days. You didn't roll out half the sideline. Yeah, that's the photo right there. And you look at Eddie; he's like the eye of the tiger. He's staring at the other guy. The other guy's looking at the coin toss that's about to happen. But Eddie's got his eyes fixed on Fred Miller, who was the Zion of the Miller brewing family. And so yeah, that was a game in which the Notre Dame team was transitioning at the time from the Ramblers to the Fighting Irish. It was right around that time. Newt Rockne had, I think it had been a few years before. The Four Horsemen had been in play. Red Grange had just graduated and was trying to make a go of, the National Football League. But college football was the story at the time, as you know. And so yeah, this was the big game, and this was the moment for Burke to shine. And unfortunately for Navy, they lost that day.
Yeah, and anyone who's familiar with my work knows that, what really grabs me is when the local boys done good and, make a mark on the national scene. And, it's just that picture can't be painted dramatically enough. That here's this guy from Larksville High School, captain of the biggest college football game by attendance to date in the history of the sport. Just
Right.
awesome.
We'll experiment a lot of them too.
Absolutely.
If you go through, I think it's the Times record, you go through the newspaper archives. Every time Eddie came home, there was a blurb in the paper about him coming home. Every time something significant happened to him, when it was announced that there was a possibility he was going to be a captain, there was a news story about it. When he was announced captain, they had at a local theater, they had a reception for him, and the local, I don't know, the Chamber of Commerce, they gave him a leather satchel in appreciation for the acclaim that he was bringing to the region. And so they made a lot of them. The community really made a lot of Burke back in his days. And that was all for football.
Right. And it's that kind of is a segue into some of the research that you had to do for this book, because anytime you're writing about World War II, you're dealing with people and events that were covered extensively in the newspaper, but more often than not, people who have been dead for a couple generations. So when you got the idea for Unsinkable, I know that there was family history that we'll get into. Where do you start? And
Yeah.
where does it go in terms of the research process?
Well, you start with your fascination. That's where it began for me. I quickly understood that to tell the Plunkett story, the Plunkett was the name of the destroyer, the U.S. Navy destroyer that Ed Burke commanded. To tell the Plunkett story, it was going to be important to focus on, some of the Plunkett's crew and officers. And so I found the five people that I was going to tell the story, and I became fascinated with each one of them. So if I wanted to know what happened to them after the war, I wanted to know what happened to them before the war. I did a deep dive on each of the men, through some of the ancestry.com, research tools. I was able to go back into the past of some of these men and find out things that they never even knew. One of the five men, principal men in the story, was the grandson of a Civil War soldier. Was the grandson of a man whose father kept slaves and had slaves were friends of his grandfather's, things that he didn't know, because the internet has opened so much of the past, has unlocked so much of the past. all the stuff has become accessible. So I was fascinated with all the stuff that preceded them, with as much as I could find out about their boyhoods. And then I was as interested in what happened to them after the war too, because we all see these stories. We come into these stories about the war, um, and you come to the end of it, and you have established a relationship with these men. Like think of the Band of Brothers. So many people have seen that series, and you wonder what happened to them after the fact. I mean, they have been through the most cataclysmic event of the 20th century, if not of all time, and how do you drift away from that? And so I wanted to get into the book as well, a little bit about what the repercussions were like for them in the wake of the war. So back to your question, Matt. Yeah, I did a deep dive into the ancestry files, and then I spent a lot of time in the Navy logs, the National Personnel Record Center. I was looking at ships logs, every record that is available on the USS Plunkett. I think I found it. Um, the personnel records for these men, I've done a deep dive, worked with family to get access to their records, pulled that up. I mean, some of those service jackets are a gold mine of information. You can find letters in there and pictures and stories, and so it all sort of builds on itself. You pull one thread, and pretty soon that thread thickens into a piece of string, and pretty soon the string's a cable. It just, the more you pull, the stronger it gets, and the more alluring it gets. And the discovery is one of the most exhilarating parts of the process of telling the story. So.
Me too. I totally agree. With Eddie Burke, is there any detail? We might be skipping ahead a little bit, but is there any detail? And if we're skipping ahead, let me know, because then we'll
Yeah.
slow it down. That really stuck with you and fascinated you.
Well, yeah, there's this one that I always keep thinking about, and it was discovered. I worked with Ed's grandson, also named Ed Gipple, and we got the service jacket for his grandfather. And there is in this story something that had been rumored about Burke. The other men had heard these stories of their commanding officer. It's very vague, had no specifics, but thought that he had been court-martialed at one point in his past. And so there it was in his records. After he graduated from the academy, Burke came back to the academy to train the boxing team for a while. But then he was very quickly routed out into the fleet. He was in China for a number of years. And while he was in China, he worked on submarines for several years, thought he was going to make his career that way, and came up out of the submarines and was on this smaller ship, the USS Pigeon. And all of the reports that would come down from his commanding officers were glowing reports. They knew this guy was had the right stuff. And so his career was flying high. He's on the Pigeon, and there's a hurricane coming. And Eddie is on the bridge. He's the ship's navigator, and it's his responsibility to make sure the ship stays in ship shape for the storm. And so they make all their preparations. The storm comes. He hasn't slept in however long, and the captain of the ship says, "You've got to get some sleep. You go down and get a couple hours sleep." He didn't want to go. He was made to go. And of course, when he went, the ship ran aground, which is a serious offense in the Navy. And mea culpa, he took the fall for it. He explained what happened. He shouldn't have been blamed, but the Navy at that time pinned responsibility, and he never defended himself personally. But the story came out, and anyone who looked at the details of what had happened knew that he was in no way to blame. There should not be a blemish on his career. And that protest went up through the chain of command, and finally he was completely exonerated, and they realized they had made a mistake. He had not made a mistake. They had, and so his career, continued on. He was given one command after another, and pretty soon here comes the war.
Yeah, that's actually a great segue then into
Yeah,
the war because that kind of fills in the gaps. Because his senior year at Navy, I think, was 1928-29. So that kind of fills in some of the 30s with him being in China. Of course, World War II comes around. And the book is Unsinkable, and it's about the USS Plunkett, as it's called. Um, it's a Navy destroyer ship. What exactly does that mean? Like, take us inside what the role of this ship is, where it's traveling, how many men, what sort of protections it has to take. Like, what should we know about a Navy destroyer such as Plunkett?
Sure. Well, when you think of the five iconic ships of the USS Navy, the U.S. Navy, you think of the game, battleship, right? We've got submarines, aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Those are the big five. And the destroyer came into its own around 1900, and it had three functions. It could first take out torpedoes. It was commissioned as a torpedo destroyer. Its object was to go after the boats that fired the torpedoes. So it was a destroyer. And then as submarines came into play, it acquired the ability with depth charges to go after submarines. And then during the First World War, when airplanes came into play, the deck was mounted with 5-inch guns, an array of guns, 1.1-inch guns, 20 millimeter cannon to go after airplanes. So it was going after attack from under the water, in the water, and over the water. That was a destroyer. It was the most versatile of all the Navy ships. They were called tin cans because the hull of a destroyer was only 3/8 of an inch thick. You compare that to a battleship, which is a foot thick of metal. So they were built light to go fast. They were as long as a football field and most of its end zones. They held the crew was about 275 men. There were somewhere between a dozen and 15 officers. And their function was to fight the fight. I often think of them as the grunt on point in the jungle, the Minuteman behind the stone wall. They were usually the first ships into the fray. They guarded they guarded the peripheries of the huge task force convoys during the Second World War that would cross back and forth on the Atlantic, or task forces in the Pacific. They were around the edge of these huge steaming lines of ships, bigger ships, Liberty ships, making sure, listening for submarines, looking out for aircraft overhead, and certainly for lighter boats that were coming at the convoy from on the surface. And so, because they were fast. I mean, they were as fast as a racehorse. They could steam at 40 miles per hour. So really fast. I mean, think of a ship as big as a football field going as fast as a racehorse. That was the destroyer. So their job was to be everything. I mean, there were more destroyers in the war than any other kind of ship. They were that versatile, and they were everywhere. As one of the Plunkett crew members said to me about the USS Plunkett, he said, "We was everywhere all the time." And that's a good fitting emblem for the destroyer.
So if you've got 250 to 275 men on board, about a dozen officers, Eddie Burke, for a time, was the captain. Now, there's only one captain of the
Right.
ship, correct?
Yeah.
I mean, just could you explain his authority on the Plunkett and, how everybody sort of answered to him?
Yeah, sure. So the way it worked, it was a very segregated situation. Officers and men, as the crew were often referred to, they were the men, and the officers were the officers. Um, they didn't really mix. The officers took their meals in the wardroom and sort of huddled with each other. And the crew reported to the chief petty officers. They were their immediate commanding officers. And the captain's domain was the bridge and the wings of the bridge up on the forward part of the ship. You can think of the superstructure in the middle of the ship and those windows. A lot of times in your picture of the sort of archetypal ship, you can see that's the bridge, the front. And that's where Burke was all the time. And that reported to him were, the gunnery officer and the officer who managed the fire rooms and the engine rooms. And so he dispatched his orders to them. They fanned them out to the chief petty officers. So it all flowed down. I mean, there's a chain of command, and that was how it worked. But he was the be all and the end all. All the buck stopped with Eddie Burke.
And how about his personality? He didn't seem like the warmest and fuzziest kind of guy.
Yeah, that's right. You know, the commanding officer who preceded Eddie Burke was Lewis Miller, Texan. And as one of the five men at the heart of this story told me about Captain Miller, he says, Captain Miller ran a happy ship. Under Captain Miller, we were a happy ship. That meant that they were well fed. His disposition, he's a good commanding officer, knew his stuff, but did not have a reputation for being a stern disciplinarian. They'd see him laugh, for example. At one point, someone once said this about Ed Burke. You know, there were a couple of sailors met off ship, and one asked which ship he was on, and he said, "I'm on Burke's ship." And the guy said, "I should have known you weren't smiling." Um, Burke, according to the same man, Jack Simpson, same officer, said that Burke was a great wartime commander. Did not run a happy ship, but everyone respected his ability to handle that ship and to handle the command, and they had no compunction about serving under him. When Captain Miller was detached from the ship somewhat prematurely, the crew went way around the chain of command and were drunk, which might have been part of the reason why. And they sent a telegram to the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt. They wanted Captain Miller back. And once everyone got to know Eddie Burke, they also knew that, you know, should he ever be detached, there would be no telegram calling for him to come back. But the men did acquire an appreciation and affection for him, especially after what happened to them at Anzio, that none of them would ever forget. And they'd each of them that I knew would go to their dying day, you know, remembering their captain as one of the great captains of the Second World War.
And Anzio is one of the most famous battles of World War II. But you actually likened Plunkett to Forrest Gump early in your book, you know, because like Forrest Gump in the movie always found himself at the heart of all these important historical events. And Plunkett found itself near or right in so many battles that people have heard about and learned about in World War II. Could you just kind of explain um, how that happened and also why? Why was this ship at the heart of the action?
Let me see if I think I may have something right here to help tell this story a little bit. Let me see if you can see this. You see this Popular Science magazine?
Right.
Okay, this is from March of 1940, and that's the USS Plunkett.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so it was a cover boy, if you will,
Wow.
even before the war started. The Popular Science was did a story on the new class, the Gleaves class of destroyers, and for whatever reason, the Plunkett was the one they picked to picture on the cover. So as the war began, it had that little bit of notoriety. And what was distinguishing, one of the most distinguishing things about the Plunkett, and it may be the only destroyer in the U.S. Navy to have been involved in all five amphibious landings in Europe during the Second World War. There was Casablanca, the invasion in North Africa in 1942. Then there was the invasion of Sicily. And then there was the invasion of the Italian mainland on the boot of Italy at Salerno. And then there was Anzio, and then there was the invasion off the coast of southern France. And then, of course, there was Normandy. It was that's six amphibious landings. It got so close to the sands on Omaha Beach that the crew said they could about hear their hull scraping against the sand. They also had the famous film director John Ford on the ship at that time. Ford was on the Plunkett with a camera, as was another filmmaker, part of Ford's crew. They were there to take images of D-Day, and there's a whole huge myth surrounding what John Ford did on Omaha Beach on D-Day, and that story has yet to be fully found out. But he was on the Plunkett. So that's the Plunkett. That's Forrest Gump. You know, it's just showing up everywhere all the time for all the big stuff.
And the most, we mentioned Anzio a couple times now, definitely the most perilous attack that the boat suffered. Most exciting and chapter of the book, for all the good and bad of that. Um, what could you tell us about the attack at Anzio and how this ship nearly went down?
Right. Well, they went in this amphibious landing. This happened in January of 1944. And it happened because the Allies had come ashore at Salerno in September on a beach so hot that there were German Panzer tanks right down in the sand with the guys, with the men coming in off the boat. One of my grandfather's brothers, Frank Gallagher, was put ashore. He was in the army at Salerno and would often tell the story about the Panzers coming down. A really hot beach. So the Allies from September all the way through that fall were trying to push up the boot to Rome. They wanted to take Rome. That was the objective. And they could not get there because the Germans had what was known as the Gustav line, which sort of cut Italy in half. Think of Italy, the long peninsula of Italy. And that line was fortified. They could not, they kept coming up against it. They could not get through it, partly because there were guns on the high ground at Monte Cassino. And finally, in desperation, they decided to do an end run around the Gustav line. It was Winston Churchill who had come up with this idea. It said, let's take all our fighting troops, 35,000 of them, and we'll embark from Naples and we'll go around the Gustav line and land at Anzio. Anzio was an old Roman town. It's famously, that was where Nero was fiddling while Rome was burning. So there were beaches there, and this was the place they were going to put in. And so that's what they did. This task force assembled in the Bay of Naples, and my uncle Frank, who was in the army, knew that his brother John Gallagher was on the Plunkett, had been on the Plunkett, had met him in North Africa, and decided to go out and have a rendezvous. Frank thinking, if this is going to be as hot as Salerno, I want to see my brother before I go in. And so he had a little Italian boatman row him out, and it's a whole nother story, but he got on the ship, he met his brother. Captain Burke comes down out of the bridge after Frank climbs up onto the fantail with a 5-gallon jerry can half filled with wine and blasted him. But Burke let Frank have his reunion with John, and then they put him ashore. And then the task force goes into, they go into Anzio. And so when they land the men on the beaches, it was a milk run. That's what they called it because it was not a hot beach. They established a beachhead, and it would turn out that they would be stuck on that beachhead. And by beachhead, I'm talking about an expanse that was maybe 5 miles inland and about 15 miles wide. All of those 35,000 men were stuck on that beachhead because the Germans were all around it and just kept pummeling them, and they could not break out. It would take 5 months to break out of that beachhead. But the landing, the first 2 days of it were quiet. 2 days later, all hell broke loose, and here comes the Germans, the tanks, the Luftwaffe. They came at the first bombing run was with more than 100 Luftwaffe planes. And then at the Plunkett on the January 24th, 1944, somewhere between 10 and 14 planes zeroed in on the Plunkett for whatever reason. And that never happened. That rarely happened. Usually what happened in a bombing run, when the Plunkett had been bombed before. I mean, they'd been bombed before. And the way the Germans would do it was they'd strafe the harbor, where the ships were. They'd come in, they'd drop their bombs. It was here today, 3 minutes later, they were gone. But for some reason, and it may be that from the air, they had thought that the Plunkett was actually a much bigger ship, a cruiser, because a destroyer from the air looks kind of like a bigger ship, a cruiser. They thought they had something in its grip. So between 10 and 14 planes went at them in a 25-minute set piece battle, a game of cat and mouse that goes down in the history naval books as the most harrowing engagement between a U.S. Navy ship and the German Luftwaffe during the war. Like I said, they typically only ran 3 minutes, these battles, but this one went on and on and on. And it was, you just don't read many stories about ships having to do what the Plunkett had to do during this battle.
And
So,
Plunkett shot down a couple of German planes, correct?
yeah, they got two for sure. There was a third known as a probable, and they damaged a fourth. So, of those dozen planes, they may have got four of them, three for
And how
sure.
about Plunkett? How did the members of that ship get along?
How did they get along during the battle?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, they were all as Jim Phelps, one of the five men at the heart of the book said, we were all just doing our job, and that's what they all said, you know. And it's not so much men talking down what they did because what they did was heroic. They just knew that they in order to get through it, they had to do what they had been trained to do, and so that's what they did. Jim Phelps was in one of the fire rooms. He was a water tender, and it was his job to keep the boilers running. Um, my great uncle John was a gunner on a 20 millimeter gun, and he and another 20 millimeter gun damaged one of the four planes that the Plunkett got during the war. Ken Brown, who was the gun boss, was in the director at the highest part of the ship, and he commanded the 4 5-inch guns on the Plunkett's deck. They were in a line on the ship, and those were the big guns. Those were the ones that were going after the dive bombers, and so they were all working in coordination. And during this battle, it was Eddie Burke's job on the bridge. He had to do two things at once. He had to play offense and defense at the same time. And, just like he did, just like football players did back in the day in the 1920s. He played offense, he also played defense. Just like Eddie Burke did, in the ring. The Luftwaffe had him on the ropes, and he was taking it and taking it and taking it. And then when he got a breather, up he pops, and his big guns are going, pointing them at the guns. Ken Brown, who was the gun boss and who was a man I got to know before he died at the age of 98, he said one of the more remarkable things that Burke had done during this battle was he had to Eddie Burke had to coordinate everything in his mind. He had to be looking at the way the planes were coming in, the way they were strafing the ship, and he had to turn the ship in the direction of the planes that would give Ken Brown the best chance to bring these planes down. He couldn't present broadside to these planes. He had to keep pointing, and so he's maneuvering the ship at speeds that are going up and down between flank and quarter. And so he's maneuvering the ship and trying to give the gun boss the ability to take down the planes, which the gun boss was doing, but he had to protect his ship at the same time. So it was a feat of ship handling and maneuvering that ultimately would result in the Navy Cross, which is the highest award that the Navy gives to its officers. If not for the bomb that actually hit the ship at the 20-minute mark, it probably would have been the Medal of Honor for Eddie Burke. But as fate would have it, there was some damage done to the Plunkett.
Damage done to the Plunkett. How about the soldiers themselves?
Right. Yeah. Well, one of the dive bombers got them with a 550-pound bomb. It hit right on the 1.1-inch gun mount, which is right behind the second stack of the ship. This was about 40 feet from where my uncle was in his gun tub on the starboard side of the ship. And when that thing exploded, it completely obliterated a dozen men who were on the 1.1-inch gun mount. Another dozen men went missing and would never be recovered. And a couple of dozen more were going to be killed. 53 men in all were killed by that ship. The ship was on fire. And what the Plunkett did after the bomb hit was just as remarkable as what it had done before the bomb hit, because this conflagration was so bad. If it got to the magazines at the back of the ship where all the ammunition was, that ship was going to explode. This had been happening to destroyers. And so they had to get that fire out. And so there was a whole nother story about these men doing what they could do to get this fire out because they had lost power, they had lost the ability to get the fire mains on it, but they figured it out fast, and got the fire put down, and they saved the ship.
All right, Jim. Well, as we wrap up here, we're on the free plan of Zoom that I have, so we got about 3.5 minutes left.
Sure.
In closing here, what is the legacy that you hope people take from the members of the Plunkett, and especially Eddie Burke, since he was the captain and he's who we're talking about today?
Right. I think, the most remarkable thing in getting to know these men was the affection and the fidelity that they felt for each other. They had come together to fight the good fight during the good war, and they would always be bonded by what had happened to them, because they were on the same ship. All men in the Navy, have that bond. These men also had what happened to them because they were in the war, on the same ship in the war. And thirdly, they had Anzio. That's what really galvanized them. Those three trials by fire created a bond of fidelity that would endure for the rest of their lives. They would never forget each other. And one of the silver linings of a story like this is just that, is that fidelity, is the way that they had come together. That was the most heartening thing for me, to be exposed to the affection that they felt for each other, how they'd never forget each other, was almost a testament to the goodness that resides in each of us, that kind of feeling and communion for one another. That was the thing that always moves me. There's a line that was in a poem that I was reading. Let's see if I can find it, where there was a poet who said something about the legacy of having been through all that during the war. The poet was George Oppman, and he wrote, "I cannot even now altogether disengage myself from those men." And he wrote that poem after the war. And so, yeah, for me, that is the thing that endures about the Plunkett, is that.
Very well said. And just to tie a bow on Eddie Burke's life and career as well, he ultimately rose to the rank of Rear Admiral, I believe,
Okay.
retired in 1959 and died in 1967. Too young, just 59 years old.
Right.
But thanks to, World War II historians, journalists like yourself, their stories live on. So Jim, thank you very much for taking some time. Again, this was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's fun for me too, Matt. Thank you.